I created the FISA process at FBI.
Is your perspective that the FISA program itself has kind of gone off the rails?
Yeah, the FISA process got badly corrupted after I left. I think it is my failure to anticipate the problem that would come. I've tried to think of ways that I could go back and change things, but I don't know anybody in government anymore.
FISA is an expansive surveillance authority in the United States. It was sold as a reform, a way to put the surveillance of people in the US under court oversight and the rule of law, instead of letting agencies run it without warrants. But it wasn't the oversight fix that the public was promised.
Section 702 is highly controversial for inherently sweeping up and storing vast amounts of data from Americans.
Tens of millions of Americans are caught up in the surveillance dragnet.
Repeatedly abused under both Republican and Democratic administrations. It's become a tool of mass domestic surveillance and an end run around the Fourth Amendment as well.
Every few years, the government reauthorizes certain sections of FISA, and the news is filled with people arguing about it. But despite all the media, most people have no idea what FISA even is. So in this video, I want to tell you the story of how a surveillance law that was sold as a reform became the legal foundation for one of the most powerful warrantless surveillance systems in America. FISA was created to stop intelligence agencies from spying on people in the US without oversight. But over time, the guardrails came off. And the person who helped build some of these guardrails at the FBI now says the system has gone badly wrong.
The FBI and the NSA are the two organizations that use the FISA process the most. But the FBI, we receive and create more FISAs than all the rest of government.
I got to interview Spike Bowman, the man who set up the FISA process at the FBI. And what made this interview so fascinating was that on top of explaining how FISA works from the inside, he explained to me exactly how the safeguards that he built were later dismantled. And once that happened, the system ballooned into something much bigger and more dangerous than anything the public was promised.
It's a system which, if corrupted, can cause the American public to lose faith in the organization, which has happened, I think, with the FBI.
Here's what I've come to believe. FISA keeps getting reauthorized because most people don't understand it. And if they did, they would be utterly shocked by what's going on. We'll start with why FISA was created, what it actually did, how the FBI safeguards were built, and how they came apart just as FISA expanded into something far more powerful than most Americans realize. Let's get started by understanding the lead-up to FISA. It was the 1970s. The Pentagon Papers, which revealed years of government lies about the Vietnam War, left the public deeply skeptical of the national security state. Then came Watergate, which exposed that Nixon, the sitting president, had weaponized federal agencies for his own political survival, using their surveillance powers to go after journalists, activists, and anyone he saw as a threat. And finally, a bombshell New York Times article revealed that the CIA, an agency barred from operating on US soil, had been running illegal surveillance operations against Americans at home. And this went beyond any one administration. The intelligence community had been breaking the law on its own initiative for decades. So in 1975, the Senate created the Church Committee to investigate the intelligence agencies and uncover the full extent of their abuses. What they found was the most extensive documentation the country had ever seen of intelligence agencies operating entirely outside the law. There was warrantless collection of Americans' communications, watch lists of journalists, activists, and members of Congress, people whom the government saw as political threats. Infiltration and disruption of the civil rights and anti-war movements, surveillance and blackmail of civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., and Operation Chaos, the CIA program the New York Times had exposed, now documented in full, revealing the surveillance of American anti-war protesters by an agency banned from operating inside the country. And to be clear, none of these programs were legal. Several were run by the NSA, an agency that, like the CIA, was also barred from operating inside the US.
FBI is the only intelligence office allowed to operate on U.S. soil.
So in the aftermath of the Church Committee findings, the pressure was enormous to put boundaries on the intelligence agencies. And what Congress came up with was FISA. It stands for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Now, how was this meant to fix the problem? Well, basically, there are two different areas of law that are relevant here: national security law and domestic criminal law, and they operate under different rules. Spying on Americans for domestic criminal investigations falls under criminal law. That requires warrants and probable cause. Spying on foreign threats abroad falls under national security law, and that doesn't require warrants or probable cause. But there was this grey middle zone. Do you need a warrant and probable cause if you're spying on Americans, but it's for national security reasons, i.e. foreign intelligence? So when you suspect someone inside the US is secretly acting as an agent of a foreign power? It wasn't clear at the time what the rules were, and FISA was an attempt to formalize them. On paper, FISA authorized electronic surveillance for foreign intelligence purposes inside the United States, and it required the government to get court orders before conducting that surveillance, and created a special court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, or FISC, to issue those orders. Now let's dive into the nuts and bolts of FISA and answer the question: did FISA actually fix the problems the Church Committee had exposed? It's complicated. On the one hand, there was a real problem it was trying to solve. Foreign intelligence investigations are different from ordinary criminal ones. They often involved classified sources, foreign agents, and ongoing operations, information that can't just be aired in open court. So many argued that there needed to be a separate process for this kind of surveillance. And for the first time, FISA created court oversight for foreign intelligence surveillance inside the US, where before there had been none. But that's only one side of the story, because the same features that made FISA necessary also made it dangerous. Before 1978, when intelligence agencies surveilled Americans, they were doing it with no statute and no court approval, in what many argued was outside the law. FISA changed that. It created a legal pathway for the government to surveil people inside the US, as long as it could convince the FISA court that there was probable cause the target was a foreign power or an agent of one. So surveillance that many considered illegal became surveillance that was simply regulated. The agencies got legitimacy, and the public got the appearance of oversight. That was the first major problem. Then there was the issue that the category at the heart of FISA, foreign intelligence, had a fuzzy boundary. And when you create a special legal category with weaker protections than ordinary criminal law, agencies have every incentive to push as much of their work as possible into it. Because once an investigation can be framed as foreign intelligence, the normal protections that shield Americans from surveillance don't fully apply. The next major problem was secrecy. And to be fair, some secrecy is necessary. You can't run operations against spies and foreign agents in public.
Most of national security law is no different from other law. The real difference is that it takes place with decision-making in secret. We advise the same type of thing that other lawyers in government advise, but the persons who are making decisions have to make those decisions in secrecy in order to carry out whatever their mission is.
But secrecy also makes accountability much harder. If the public can't see how a law is being interpreted, it becomes almost impossible to challenge abuses or even know they're happening.
I saw two secret rulings, interpretations of FISA law, of how the government has created additional loopholes to spy on you that I'm not even allowed to tell you. These are classified as top secret.
And finally, the FISA court is a one-sided process. It usually hears only from the government, with no one in the room arguing against them. And the targets usually never know that they were surveilled. So yes, FISA created oversight, But it also created a secret court, applying a special surveillance standard in a process where only one side ever gets heard. So the FISA court was never going to provide enough oversight on its own. If this system was going to work, it needed extremely strong internal safeguards before applications even reached the court. It needed the court to just be a final check, with other people providing pushback early in the process, asking questions like, is this application accurate? Does this justify surveillance? And that brings us to Spike. Eventually, the FBI recruited Spike to build a real FISA process with genuine checks and balances, and the system he designed drew directly from his specialized background as a judge advocate.
What is a judge advocate?
A judge advocate is a military lawyer.
They specialize in the laws of armed conflict and military operations, and they sit right there in the war room next to commanders, weighing in on whether actions are legal and constitutional before they're taken.
Let me give you a very quick example of how it worked. One of the judge advocates I trained was in the war room in Korea, and there was an incursion into South Korea by North Korean jets. And the South Korean pilots requested permission to engage the North Koreans. And the commander standing by the judge advocate turned around and said, "What do you think, Judge?" He said, "No, sir." And the commander turned and said, "Permission denied." And then he turned back to the judge advocate and said, "Let's go get a cup of coffee and you can tell me why I did that."
The idea was to get constant legal counsel as a real-time check on operational decisions. This kind of embedded legal advice was still new to the intelligence world, and Spike was right at the front of it.
I was the first judge advocate to go to the National Security Agency.
He trained others to do the same work and eventually brought the whole model to the FBI.
I placed a lawyer in each of the intelligence-related units at the FBI headquarters so that the units could be able to turn to a lawyer and say, "What do you think?" That was the beginning of the FISA process.
This process created a system of constant checks and legal oversight long before the FISA court ever got involved.
It starts with a single agent in the field who thinks he needs a FISA. That agent has to go to his assistant special agent in charge to see if that ASAC agrees.
The application then goes to the relevant intelligence unit, where Spike had embedded a lawyer, right there, ready to advise.
The back and forth between the headquarters and the agent in the field could take months. If there was a problem, the lawyer in the unit would come to me and we would talk about it. If he did not think there was a problem, the FISA would come to me to review, and I would opine on it. If I agreed with it, I would send it to the Department of Justice. I would personally take every FISA to the person that had to certify that the purposes of this FISA was to gain intelligence, not criminal law.
Only after surviving all of this would an application reach the court. Now, the FISA court gets a lot of flack for approving almost everything. But that's because most weak applications were killed upstream by the pipeline Spike built. The court was the final filter on applications that had already survived multiple rounds of review.
I reviewed every single FISA that came through. That was probably a mistake. I probably should have had other people doing that. But it was such a new process that I just took it on.
And that gets at something important. This process worked because of who Spike was.
Give me a little bit of your background.
I was an intelligence officer who was sent to law school. There aren't any such people, really. Real difference between me and another lawyer is that, first of all, I was an intelligence officer who saw the other side of things before I became a lawyer. And secondly, because I spent 27 years on active duty, I was steeped in the idea of leadership. Again, you don't teach either one of those things in law school.
So his role in building the FISA process was, in a way, a perfect match. But a system that depends on the perfect person has a hidden flaw, because perfect people don't stay in their positions forever.
The FISA process got badly corrupted after I left. And it's a question of people that come into power not understanding what has to be done.
After Spike left in 2006, the system he built began to change. The lawyers who had been embedded inside the intelligence units, giving real-time guidance before a surveillance request ever became a formal application, were taken out of these units. Spike's model, where legal counsel was part of the decision, was replaced by something far more passive.
Lawyers coming back from the units and going into an office where they just waited for things to come to them.
That might sound like a boring bureaucratic reshuffle, but it changed the entire nature of the safeguard. The whole point of Spike's system was that legal review happened early. Once those frontline checks were gone, the system became much easier to exploit. And one of the clearest public examples was the Carter-Page FISA applications, which contained at least 17 significant errors and omissions. In the most blatant case, an FBI lawyer doctored an email, literally altering the wording of a CIA message to make the case for surveilling an American look stronger than it was. He later pled guilty to a federal crime.
It was demonstrated at the FBI that a single attorney was able to change things and create a fraud on the FISA court. That simply could not have happened when I was there. The program I left behind would not have allowed that.
This is why those internal safeguards mattered, because the FISA court usually hears only from the government. There's no opposing party in the room pushing back or saying, hold on, that email's been altered. So if the FBI's own process doesn't catch a problem before it reaches the court may never know. And in the Carter-Page case, the fraud only came to light years later through a separate investigation. By then, the surveillance had already happened.
It's sort of a problem that I've been wrestling with ever since, trying to figure out how I should have really done things, how I should have corrected things. And I don't know. It's a problem that I left behind, I think.
But I don't think the lesson is that Spike personally failed. He had built safeguards into a system that had every incentive to weaken them. His safeguards forced people to justify surveillance requests before they reached the court and put lawyers close enough to the process that they could ask uncomfortable questions before things moved forward. But those kinds of safeguards are always vulnerable inside an agency under constant pressure to get more access, more information, more quickly with fewer obstacles. And it's not unique to the FBI. That's just how government power tends to work. Over time, the pressure is towards expanding access, not restricting it. So once Spike left and was no longer there to defend this system, the process became corrupted and dismantled. But the collapse of these safeguards was only the beginning. In 2008, 2 years after Spike left, came the FISA Amendments Act, a massive expansion of FISA that created Section 702.
702 allows us to collect data streams of information.
Under traditional FISA, the government had to name a specific target and apply for an individual order against them. Under Section 702, the government no longer had to identify targets to the court at all. Instead, each year, the Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence certify broad categories of surveillance. Categories like terrorism, weapons proliferation, cyber threats, narcotics. And the FISC approves those categories in a blanket order. The NSA then decides which data to collect and which not to, without any external review. In essence, Section 702 authorizes the collection of data from inside US domestic infrastructure and allows the government to compel US companies to hand it over. It targets foreigners abroad. But because those foreigners communicate with Americans, it sweeps in vast amounts of Americans' private data too. All of it goes into a database the FBI can later search for Americans without a warrant.
Those data streams are ones and zeros. And the question is whether any of the ones and zeros are ones that we are interested in. What it was information that said, a person unnamed, unknown, but a person did this in the United States, and it may be of interest to you.
This system is supposed to protect Americans by keeping their identities hidden. But when the information was distributed to different agencies, people in those agencies
had the ability to say, I need to know who this person was in order to do my job. That was badly corrupted.
Because while the government may have the ability to look at something, it doesn't mean it has the right to.
We now have the ability to do things that are not relevant to the investigation, but will expose what a person is doing, where they are. The ability to look at people without a great reason to do so, that has happened. If it's not part of the investigation, it's none of our business.
So you think there's some abuse of power going on with all this unfettered access?
Yeah, that is abuse of power.
It's on the record that officials, going back multiple administrations, constantly request to unmask Americans' identities.
We allowed those decision makers to do more than what their job actually required. And that was a serious mistake.
The overreach gets more and more dangerous the more data governments collect. Section 702 operates at a level completely unlike anything that existed in 1978. There were roughly 350,000 surveillance targets in 2025, and every person that these targets interact with gets their interactions swept up in this mass surveillance program, which means hundreds of millions of Americans have their email, text, calls, and activities swept up in a database that the FBI can search at will. So officially, Section 702 targets foreigners. In practice, it builds a database of Americans' communications, and the FBI, along with every other agency that gets 702 data, routinely searches it, specifically to find and use Americans' communications. It's a system with hundreds of thousands of documented abuses. A declassified FISA court opinion revealed that the FBI had run more than 278,000 non-compliant queries of Section 702 data in 2020 and 2021 alone. The targets of those improper searches included Americans who attended protests, 19,000 donors to a single congressional campaign, a sitting US senator, a state senator, and a state judge who had complained to the FBI about a local police chief, journalists, congressional staff, crime victims. The list goes on. The FISA court called the FBI's compliance problems persistent and widespread. Opinions documenting systematic violations come out year after year after year. And it's getting worse. In 2025, the FBI disclosed that its queries of Americans' data rose 35%. Only about 28% of those searches returned any results, which means the FBI is running huge numbers of searches through Americans' private communications and getting nothing back. That looks a lot less like targeted investigation and a lot more like phishing. And the consequences? Essentially none. No FBI agent faced any meaningful discipline. The Bureau kept its querying authority. It promised new training and procedures, and the FISA court said promises were sufficient. But FISA itself isn't so easily fixed. It keeps getting renewed and keeps getting bigger, and today it's expanded far beyond its original justification. There are some reforms being floated, and separately, Representative Thomas Massie introduced the Surveillance Accountability Act, which would require warrants for all government searches, and includes in the definition of a search things like automatic license plate readers and facial recognition surveillance. Without legislation forcing the issue, the agencies have no reason to give up any of this power on their own.
I don't see the FBI putting strictures on its own power. I don't see them putting safeguards in that decrease the amount of information they get access to.
And this is another failure that is pretty much government-wide.
And so is your perspective that the FISA program itself has kind of gone off the rails?
Yeah, I did not set it up correctly. I'm not sure exactly how I would do it today, but that's That's a problem that I wrestle with even today.
Spike blames himself, but the most robust process would always have weakened over time because every incentive pushes towards more access into our lives, not less. Building this machine in the first place is the issue. The databases, the access, the authority to reach into the private lives of millions of people without a warrant. This machine doesn't care who inherits it. It works exactly as well for the worst person as it does for the best. When you're told to trust the system, you're not being asked to trust the careful, decent person who built it. You're being asked to trust everyone who will ever hold it after them. Every administration, every director, every future official whose name you don't know yet. So don't picture the people who promise that they'll never abuse it. Picture the one you fear most, the politician you would never vote for, the official who already thinks people like you are the enemy. Now hand them the machine, fully loaded. Section 702 is a weapon that we keep handing forward, trusting that whoever picks it up next will be as restrained as the last person who held it. But that was never a safe bet. The question is not whether we can trust the people in charge today. It's why we built something this dangerous to hand to anyone at all. This video was brought to you by the Ludlow Institute, a non-profit dedicated to advancing freedom through technology. We are supported entirely by the community. If you would like to support this work and keep this channel free and accessible to more and more people, visit ludlowinstitute.org/donate. I really appreciate every single one of you who supports this channel. It really means so much. Together, we are making a difference.